Every so often in language, we do something just to remind ourselves that the point of language is to enjoy stories. Whether you're enjoying writing them or reading them or we're learning something from them, it's not just about learning some good strategies for good readers. It's about being a good reader and having fun with that. So today we're going to enjoy some literature. I have the book we've been reading, and I'm going to read one more chapter for you. There are 3 chapters left. The last 2 are pretty short, so I'll probably put them together, but we're almost done this book. So, chapter 18, here we go. Do you remember where we left Norman? He was like basically hanging off a cliff, singing doo-dah, doo-dah, hoping that his family was going to come looking for him. All right, let's go. Chapter 18. Michael set off in the direction Mrs. Smith said Norman had been heading. Since she had already driven along this road, he kept turning off down side streets and then back to the main one. Every couple of blocks, he stopped and yelled Norman's name. Long before he got near the park, the evening rush hour traffic was getting heavy. He didn't think Norman would have stayed on the road with so many cars, especially when he was towing Fluffy. The quiet park roads would be safer. Michael turned in to park at the first entrance road he came to. He got off his bike and pushed it along so he could look closely at the muddy ground beside the road. Then he saw what looked like skateboard tracks and slowed down. He almost missed where they turned away from the road. The grassy places didn't show any traces of tracks, but every so often there were more muddy patches. Marks in the mud led him to a large tree. Under it he found a plastic sandwich bag, a banana peel, and an empty juice can like the kind Norman had taken. But this junk couldn't be Norman's. He would have put the peel and can in the bag and carried it until he found a trash container. Then Michael looked more closely at the plastic bag. In it were 4 more baked beans, the same size and shade of brown as the ones that had fallen out of Norman's sandwich in the kitchen. He had been here. Quickly inspecting the ground all around, Michael found another wheel track at the beginning of the trail marked Lookout Point. He got back on his bike and rode into the woods. Crisp leaves crunched under his wheels. His front wheel sank into a mud patch, throwing him over. As he got up, he saw a green leaf lying atop the yellow, red, and brown leaves of the forest. It was one of Fluffy's. The plant must have tipped over here. "Norman!" he yelled. There was no answer. He hurried on. Thinking he heard something, he stopped to listen, but it was far off. It might be a voice. He bounced on along the path, slipping and sliding. He stopped again to listen. This time he recognized the sound. It was a faint, familiar voice singing, "Oh, Susanna." Michael felt relieved and annoyed at the same time. Everybody was worried sick, and here Norman was just hanging around the park singing and probably scaring the squirrels and birds with the noise. Racing on, Michael burst out of the woods. Across the parking spaces, he saw Fluffy braced against a thick wooden railing and leaning over it, with all his vines reaching down. They were stretched tight. Michael dropped his bike and ran to the railing. Norman was hanging around the park, but not the way Michael had expected. His body was tightly cradled in Fluffy's vines. His feet were in midair. "Help!" said Norman. "Fluffy's got me, but he can't pull me up." Michael said, "I'll pull on Fluffy." "No!" said Norman. "His vines might break. One of them already did." Michael lay down on the ground and tried to reach his brother. He needed to hang on to the post or crossbar of the railing to keep himself from sliding off the cliff, but he couldn't reach Norman that way. Let me think a minute," he said. "Can Fluffy hold you a little longer while I go find help?" "No, he's been holding me a long time. He looks tired. I'm really scared." Michael saw the plant was still tied to Norman's bike with the tow rope. The knot wouldn't come apart fast enough, so he cut the rope, quickly sawing it with his pocket knife. He made a big loop with that end and a square knot. He pulled on it hard to make sure it wouldn't slip, and then he lowered the loop to Norman. "Hang on with both hands," he said. He lined up Norman's bike, still tied to the other end of the rope. Then he got on and pressed the pedals with all his might. The bike inched along, dragging Norman up and just over the edge. Norman's feet were back on the ground. "I'm up!" he shouted. Michael dragged him a little farther to make sure. Then he dropped the bike and went to help him. He couldn't pull him under the railing because Fluffy's vines hanging over the railing were still wrapped tightly around him. "Tell Fluffy he can let go now," said Michael. With Norman talking and singing to him, Fluffy slowly began to relax his grip. He looked exhausted and could hardly move his vines. So Michael gently untangled them from Norman. Norman looked almost as bad as Fluffy. His jacket and face were smeared with dirt. His hair stood up in little tufts pointing in all directions. Dirt encrusted his fingernails. Dirt was embedded in his shoelaces. When he stood up, he staggered a little until he got his balance. The first thing he did was hug Fluffy. Then he threw his arms around Michael. "Are you okay?" asked Michael, patting him on the back. "Yeah," replied Norman, snuffling. "I am now." Michael said, "We have to find a phone and call home. Dad and Mrs. Smith are out looking for you, too." "What about Mom?" asked Norman. She's frantic, too. She's home waiting for you or anybody who finds you to call. Whatever made you think running away was a good idea?" "I didn't think," replied Norman. "I just wanted to save Fluffy." "But Fluffy saved you," said Michael. "Are Mom and Dad gonna be mad at me?" asked Norman. "Well, Dad said they wouldn't. They'll just be glad to get you back. They were worried sick." "Were you worried?" asked Norman. "Yeah, me too. Come on, let's go home." They retied the tow rope around Fluffy and tucked his vines carefully around him so they wouldn't drag. He was still too tired to lift them. They took the Lookout Point Road out of the park to the main road. Halfway home, they saw a payphone. So remember how this book was written before cell phones were a thing? So like if you needed to call someone, you'd find a payphone and put money in and make a phone call. Just you know. "I found him," Michael told Mom. "He was in the park. He's okay and we're on the way home." Mom insisted on talking to Norman to be sure he was all right. "Hurry home," she said. She and Mrs. Smith and Bob were waiting on the curb when the boys and Fluffy rode down the street. Mom hugged Norman so hard he couldn't even breathe. Then she hugged Michael just as hard. Mrs. Smith went on home, saying she wanted to hear all about it later. Bob followed them into the house. Michael was just explaining how he found Norman's tracks when they heard the car zoom into the drive. Dad rushed in and hugged Norman, breathless again. "Where have you been?" Dad asked. But Norman couldn't reply immediately because all the air had been squashed out of him again. "He was in the park," said Mom. "What were you doing in the park?" asked Dad, letting go. Norman sucked in some air and replied, "I was hanging off a cliff." This news had a dramatic effect on Mom, Dad, and Bob. They looked aghast. "But Fluffy saved me," Norman continued. "He held on to me over the edge for the longest time until Michael came, so I didn't fall off." "It's true," said Michael. "Fluffy was a hero." Everyone turned to look at Fluffy. He still looked awful. He was bent over, his leaves were limp and bedraggled. He even seemed a paler shade of green than usual. Michael said, "He saved Norman's life. He should get a big reward." "Like what?" asked Bob. "We should give him a good home forever with the person who cares about him more than anything else in the world, Norman." "Yeah," said Norman. "That's right," said Bob. This suggestion was greeted with silence from Mom and Dad. Then Norman piped up, "Michael helped save me too. Fluffy couldn't drag me up. Michael did it, so he should get a big reward too." "Like what?" chimed in Bob. He couldn't have been a better stooge if they'd rehearsed him. "Stanley," said Norman. "He should get to keep Stanley." "That's right," said Bob, nodding. "Bob," said Mom, "isn't it about time for dinner at your house?" Norman asked, "Can he stay for dinner?" "Tomorrow," replied Mom. "Bob, ask your mom if you can have dinner with us then." "Okay," said Bob. He turned to Norman. "If you run away again, you should stay at my house. And if I run away, I'll stay at your house." "Okay," said Norman, "but I'm not running away ever again. It was terrible." "Cool," said Bob. He dashed out the door. Michael and Norman just stood around waiting for Mom and Dad to say something about rewards for saving Norman. But Dad only said, "What are we having for dinner?" "Before that," said Mom, "we better do first aid on Fluffy." Michael thought that was a good sign. They gathered around to take care of the plant. Norman watered him because he was all dried out from his efforts. Mom gently wiped the dust and mud smears from his leaves. Michael slowly dripped orange juice into his ice cream cone-shaped leaves. Dad cut a fudge ripple sock into small pieces to make it easier to eat. Norman coaxed Fluffy to eat by putting the tiny pieces into a rolled-up leaf. Fluffy made small, feeble slurp sounds. Dad said, "Okay, now what are we having for dinner?" I have no idea," said Mom. "Somebody suggest something." Michael said, "Norman and I can make dinner." "No," said Mom. "We've been through enough uproars already today." "No, really," said Michael. "We can do it. We'll surprise you," he said. "Go in the living room and wait." Mom and Dad wanted to discuss the plant situation in private anyway, so they did as Michael suggested. Michael and Norman argued in whispers about what to have for dinner. They decided to compromise. Michael called a pizza delivery place, and Norman started getting out the bread. Norman said, "Go listen to what they're saying." "You go," said Michael. "They won't get mad at you if they catch you listening because you almost fell off a cliff." But Dad and Mom were arguing in such quiet whispers that he could not make out what they were saying. 20 minutes later, Dad and Mom were surprised when the doorbell rang. Michael ran to answer it. A delivery man handed over a large pizza. Michael paid for it with his own money. "Dinner's ready," he said, and led the way to the dining room. The table was nicely set up with 4 chairs and 6 plates. Fluffy, who was looking better now, and Stanley stood at 2 of the plates. On the plates for Mom, Dad, and Michael and Norman were baked bean sandwiches. On Fluffy and Stanley's plates were fudge ripple socks. The ones for Stanley, of course, which Michael had just taken off, didn't smell too good. But the delicious smell of hot pizza was so overwhelming that nobody seemed to mind. Michael opened the pizza box and put it in the middle of the table. "Yum, yum," said Mom, taking a piece. "I made the sandwiches," said Norman. "It's my new recipe so the beans don't fall out when you eat. I glued them to the bread with margarine and big blobs of ketchup." "Very creative," said Dad. "Very neat," said Norman. "No more beans on the floor." Very tasty," said Mom, trying her sandwich. Michael passed a dish of carrots and celery he had washed off but not sliced. This led to a lot of loud crunching. For the moment, nobody was talking, just eating. He wondered if he should ask again about keeping the plants or if he should wait. If they had made up their minds, surely they would say something. But what else could he do to convince them to say yes? Finally, Mom said to Dad, "Do you want to tell them, or shall I?" And that is the end of the chapter. And I am just imagining you all at home right now going, "No!" But go out for recess now or something. See you guys tomorrow. Bye.